Hello everyone and welcome to another video. The year is 1977. For the past few years, Doctor Who has been going from strength to strength. Its ratings are at the highest they've ever been, with Tom Baker's fourth Doctor proving to be even more popular than his immediate predecessor Jon Pertwee had been, which is certainly saying something given how well the show was doing towards the end of Pertwee's run. But it hasn't just been Tom Baker who's become very popular. So have his companions in Ian Marter's Harry Sullivan, Louise Jameson's Leela, and especially Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith. The latter would become so popular over the years, in fact, that she would eventually get her own spin-off TV show 30 years later. And in general, the past few years would go down in history as arguably being the very best that the show's ever had, according to quite a few of its fans. Producer Philip Hinchcliffe's idea to lean more into the horror aspect of each story would prove to be a very popular and successful way of shaking the show up a bit. And many of the stories from this era would go on to be considered some of the greatest in the show's entire history, such as Genesis of the Daleks, Pyramids of Mars, and The Deadly Assassin. But not everyone is impressed with this direction. The show has started to be accused of having excessive amounts of violence from some viewers, most notably conservative TV campaigner Mary Whitehouse. Whilst not everyone agrees with these accusations, it would be enough for the BBC to seemingly decide to move Philip Hinchcliffe onto other things, and replace him with someone who had a very different vision for the show. And this is exactly what happened, with Hinchcliffe only finding out about it when his replacement Graham Williams walked into his office one morning and told him the news. The Graham Williams era of the show would still continue the impressive ratings, but it would divide some viewers and fans, with many at the time believing the show had lost its way, after Williams was ordered to replace the gothic horror genre Hinchcliffe had chosen with more comedic and witty storylines. Obviously, the Graham Williams era has since undergone a bit of a reappreciation in the fan community, with some fans, myself included, now absolutely loving it. But for other fans, it still doesn't hold a candle compared to the supposed glory days of the Philip Hinchcliffe era. All of this begs the question, what if things had gone differently? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Philip Hinchcliffe era hadn't come to such a sudden end? What if Philip Hinchcliffe had stayed for season 15? Now I have to admit that the timing of this video is by no means an accident. I deliberately wanted to upload it around the time that the new season 15 collection box set was released, so as to tie in with it. At the time of writing, I don't know when exactly this video will come out, so it might be a few days before or after the box set's official release date, but I hope you'll enjoy watching this video regardless. As I hinted at in the intro, Hinchcliffe did come very close to staying on for another year, so it wouldn't be too difficult to imagine an alternate scenario where he did. The only thing that would have to change would be whatever led the BBC high-ups to replace him with Graham Williams. Personally, I reckon it was a mixture of giving into Mary Whitehouse's complaints, as well as trying to save some money and reduce the show's budget. So we'll say that the BBC high-ups don't feel like this just yet, and let Hinchcliffe stay on for another season. So, since Hinchcliffe would now be staying on for another year on the show, I suspect that his script editor Robert Holmes would have stayed on with him. Now, in our timeline, Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes did actually have a few vague ideas for their fourth season. So let's take a look at what these ideas were. Number 1, a story inspired by the novel Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Number 2, a story set in a Brazilian jungle. Number 3, potentially another Dalek story idea that Hinchcliffe had, involving giant chess pieces moving like they were on roller skates, although nobody but Hinchcliffe himself ever really wanted to do it. Number 4, some kind of story or stories which were very similar to what would later be done with the Indiana Jones films. In Hinchcliffe's own words, this would have seen the Doctor being like a colonial explorer, with a pith helmet out in the jungles. And number 5, a story based on Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness. This was something that Robert Holmes really wanted to do, apparently. My main source for these is the Moving On documentary originally included on the Talons of Wen Chiang special edition DVD release, as well as Wikipedia and Shannon Sullivan's website for the Heart of Darkness inspired story. Please be aware that as much as I just made out that all of those ideas were separate, it is possible that Hinchcliffe and Holmes might have combined some of them together, had they actually had the chance to make them. Indeed, that is apparently what Philip Hinchcliffe did with 2 of them, which we'll get to in a little bit. So some pretty fascinating ideas by the sounds of it. I don't know if they would be all that doable on the show's then budget, but we'll say that they're able to afford 1 or 2. I'm going to go with the Brazilian Jungle and Heart of Darkness inspired stories. I think these are the most likely stories they would have gone with, due to the direction they wanted to take the show in. Given that they would both involve rather exotic settings, I can imagine them getting the set designers to do their best to realise the jungle and African settings in studio as much as possible. I mean, I doubt very highly they would have been able to afford going to Brazil and the Congo to do a few weeks location filming. But I could be wrong, I suppose. But what exactly would these stories entail, beyond their settings and inspirations? Well, I'm going to now mention something that I hinted at earlier. You see, Philip Hinchcliffe would eventually get round to writing a storyline for the Brazilian jungle story himself. Originally entitled Valley of the Lost, he submitted it to his successor, Graham Williams, to be considered for season 17, but it was rejected due to budget concerns, as well as the fact that the whole frozen time concept was already part of another story that was being considered, called Child Prodigy, as well as a story that had just aired, that being the Armageddon Factor. The plot of this story would have seen the Doctor and Romana travelling to the Brazilian jungles in the then present day, where they encounter an alien spaceship that crashed there in 1870. This spaceship emits a bubble of time which has kept its surroundings preserved as they were around that time. This includes a lost city of gold, inhabited by savages who worship the only survivor from the crash, Godrin. Godrin convinces the Doctor to take him to London. Once there, he uses the technology available to him to summon a fleet of his people, the Lurons, to invade Earth. But the Doctor and Romana manage to infiltrate the Luron mothership and capture its power source. They threaten the Lurons to cancel their invasion and leave immediately, otherwise they will destroy the power source. The Lurons reluctantly agree, and the Earth is once again safe. It is Valley of the Lost that was the result of Hinchcliffe combining 2 of the ideas he'd had for his season 15, specifically the Brazilian jungle and Childhood's End inspired ideas. Big Finish would later adapt Valley of the Lost for their Lost Stories 4th Doctor box set in 2011, and they would rename it to the Valley of Death. This version would harken back to the story's original form by having Leela instead of Romana 2. As for the Heart of Darkness inspired story, not much is really known about it. All we can really say is that it would have presumably been set in Africa, possibly the Congo, just like the novella it was inspired by, and it might have even touched on similar themes to what Heart of Darkness did, that being the horrible European colonialism of Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm not too sure what to call this story, so feel free to comment below your suggestions for the title. Both of these stories could have quite easily fitted in with the Indiana Jones themed idea, so that's another of the potential ideas for the season that would have been added into the mix. That might have even been the plan all along. Whilst I'm not too sure whether Horror of Fanrock and Image of the Fendal have been commissioned before Philip Hinchcliffe left the show, I'm going to just say that they do still get made in this alternate timeline. They were both gothic horror stories, which was obviously the style of storytelling that Hinchcliffe and Holmes went for in their era, even if they might have been a bit different to what their plans for the season had been. And before anyone asks, but what about using the vampire mutation, the story that Horror of Fanrock replaced? Well, no, that still wouldn't be possible in this alternate timeline. The only reason why the vampire mutation, which was the original version of State of Decay, wasn't made was because the BBC were making an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel around the same time. Since I have already decided to include some of the ideas Hinchcliffe and Holmes had for their 4th season together, I can't imagine there being much chance that the other stories from our timeline season 15 would have got made, at least at the same time anyway, as they might have still been produced later on after Hinchcliffe and Holmes left. So this alternate season 15 wouldn't have the invisible enemy, Underworld, or the Invasion of Time. Maybe the Sunmakers could still be included, provided that it was a bit darker in tone to the version we got in our timeline. I say this because Robert Holmes would doubtless have still been inspired to write the story after his issues with the Taxman. An interesting consequence of there being no invisible enemy in this alternate season 15 is that K9 wouldn't have been introduced, at least at that particular point anyway. I think this is pretty likely due to the fact that K9 wouldn't easily fit into the Philip Hinchcliffe era, in my opinion. Whilst we're on the subject of companions, what about Leela? Would Louise Jameson stay on for the whole season like she did in our timeline? Or would she have left earlier, given that she was never really happy with Leela's limited growth as a character? Well, Graham Williams had been able to convince her to stay when she'd wanted to leave earlier on in our timeline's season 15. So maybe Philip Hinchcliffe might have been able to do the same for this alternate timeline. So essentially, Leela would still leave in the last story of season 15. But with there being no Invasion of Time yet, what would this final story be? Well, the best I can think of will be to have another unmade story instead, and I've got a particular one in mind. How about The Lost Legion by Douglas Camfield? This was originally submitted for season 14 in our timeline, after Camfield had expressed interest in writing his own story for the show, after he'd directed The Seeds of Doom. The plot would have seen the Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith land in North Africa, right near an isolated outpost belonging to the French Foreign Legion. This outpost will become the centre of a fight between two alien factions, the Skarkel and the Corians. Towards the end of the story, Sarah Jane would have been killed off when the last of the aliens shoots her. She would die in the Doctor's arms, with the Legionnaires constructing a funeral pyre for her, as the TARDIS dematerialises. This story would have obviously been the last to feature Sarah Jane Smith originally, with the Hand of Fear eventually replacing it after it failed to get Robert Holmes's approval. It's worth noting how Holmes had never been that keen on Camfield potentially writing for the show to begin with, although Philip Hinchcliffe was more enthusiastic about it. It would be quite easy for Leela to take Sarah Jane's place and also be killed off at the end of the story. Louise Jameson probably would have been happier with this ending for her character than the one she got in our timeline. That's being her essentially running off to marry some bloke she's only just met. Leela's fate would be something nobler and more befitting of a warrior of the Sever team. But given how the original version of the story wasn't to Robert Holmes's liking, it's difficult to say whether it would be very likely that he and Hinchcliffe would suddenly decide to revisit the idea and ask Douglas Camfield to work on it again. So as an alternative, the final story could have been a TV version of one of the Big Finish audios from the Philip Hinchcliffe Presents series. How about something like The God of Phantoms or The Genesis Chamber? I say both of these specifically because I've realised how much of this alternate season 15 would have been set on Earth. So it might be a good idea to get away from that with another story, bearing in mind the Sunmakers would have still been set on Pluto. I think Hinchcliffe was keen to get away from Earth more during his tenure anyway, given how the previous John Pertwee and Barry Letts era had been so reliant on the tried and tested Earthbound unit formula. But again, who knows how likely it is that Hinchcliffe would have come up with the same story ideas 4 decades prior. Feel free to comment below which last story you'd prefer. Regardless of what it had been, I still believe Leela deserved a better exit than she got in our timeline. So maybe she would have been killed off regardless of what the last story had been. Perhaps it could be something that Louise Jameson asked for. Whilst we're on the subject of Leela, I can imagine her eyes still changing colour at some point to account for Louise Jameson being uncomfortable with the brown contact lenses she'd originally been given. Philip Hinchcliffe might have insisted on his Leela meaning brown eyes explanation for some time, but would have probably listened to Jameson after she told him how she was considering leaving the show because of it. Also, whilst Tom Baker was quite rude and hostile to Louise Jameson to begin with, I think they still would have been able to get along with each other eventually, regardless of who was the producer. Anyway, now that that's all sorted, let's move on to the question of what next. Would Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes stay on for a 5th season? Or would they leave at the end of the alternate season 15? Well, whilst it could go in either direction, I'm going to go with Hinchcliffe and Holmes leaving at the end of the alternate season 15. If the complaints of Mary Whitehouse over the show's supposed excessive violence was indeed what inspired the BBC high-ups to replace Philip Hinchcliffe, then it would only be a matter of time until they gave in to Whitehouse and replaced him. But who would then take over? Would it still be Graham Williams or someone else? Well, if it had still been Graham Williams, then I can't imagine too much changing. The remaining stories from our timeline season 15 would have made up the alternate season 16, together with some more unmade stories. Then our timeline season 16, aka the Key to Time season, will become the alternate season 17. Then our season 17 becomes season 18, and etc. But if it had been someone else, then who knows what would have happened. Maybe former production unit manager George Galatio would have been offered it instead. It wouldn't be too unlikely, as he was offered the role when Graham Williams left in our timeline, although it would depend on his availability at that time, obviously. An interesting thing to consider is how Philip Hinchcliffe staying on Doctor Who for another year would affect the police drama he moved on to, Target. Whilst Graham Williams had been the one to create it, it was Hinchcliffe who would become its producer, after the two of them had been told to swap with each other. Perhaps Graham Williams would have produced Target himself in this alternate timeline, meaning that he wouldn't be able to take over Doctor Who from Hinchcliffe at the end of the alternate season 15. Although Target only lasted for 2 seasons, so maybe he would have been able to take over if Hinchcliffe had stayed on for season 16 as well. Regardless of what would happen with all of this, Tom Baker would obviously still stay on as the Doctor for 7 years, and he would doubtless prove to be difficult to work with whoever replaced Hinchcliffe in this alternate scenario. Since Leela wouldn't leave until the end of season 15, it might be up to whoever Hinchcliffe's successor was to come up with a new companion. Perhaps it would have still been Romana, or maybe Rodan from the Invasion of Time instead, or perhaps an entirely original character. If we were to have Finn still turn out pretty much the same as they did in our timeline, with Graham Williams still succeeding Hinchcliffe as the show's producer, then here is how each season would have gone story-wise. Season 15, 1977 to 1978. 92, Horror of Fanrock. 93, Valley of the Lost. 94, Image of the Fendal. 95, The Heart of Darkness inspired story. 96, The Sunmakers. And 97, either The Lost Legion or one of the Philip Hinchcliffe Presents stories. Season 16, 1978 to 1979. 98, The Invasion of Time. I'm going to say that Rodan is introduced as the new companion. Obviously, this alternate version of the story would be 4 parts long, not 6. 99, The Invisible Enemy, with K9 being introduced a season later than in our timeline. 100, The Unmade Story, called Shield of Zarek, with the key to time elements removed, obviously. 101, The Unmade Story called The Lords of Misrule, again with the key to time elements removed. 102, Underworld, unfortunately. 103, The Unmade Story called The Cricket Men, with it being reworked to better work with the show's limited budget. Season 17, 1979 to 1980. 104, The Ribos Operation, but with no introduction for Romana, as Rodan would take her place. 105, The Pirate Planet. 106, The Stones of Blood. 107, The Androids of Tara. 108, The Power of Kroll. And 109, The Armageddon Factor, although it might not have been completed due to the strike action that affected Sharda's production in our timeline. Season 18, 1980 to 1981. 110, Destiny of the Daleks, perhaps introducing a new second incarnation of Rodan, but still played by Lala Ward potentially. 111, City of Death. 112, The Creature from the Pit. 113, Nightmare of Eden. 114, The Horns of Naimon. And 115, Sharda, which might have actually been completed in this alternate timeline, due to what I said about the Armageddon Factor earlier on. And then J&T would still take over from Graham Williams, with Peter Davison still being cast as the 5th Doctor. But now his first season, season 19, will be the same set of stories as our timeline's season 18. And yeah, I think you get the idea by now. Each set of stories will be made a year after they have been made in our timeline. Maybe this would mean that our season 26 would never get made, as the alternate version of that season would have obviously had the same set of stories as our season 25, and the show would have likely still been cancelled in 1989. Hello, Future Bill here. I've just realised whilst I've been recording this that it wouldn't make much sense for them to have Sylvester McCoy's era start off with the Trial of a Time Lord, so you could probably just swap the alternate season 24 or Trial of a Time Lords around with the alternate season 25, aka our timeline's season 24, and yeah, that would probably make a lot more sense. I think it is a shame that Philip Hinchcliffe wasn't allowed to stay on for another season, as his era was really hitting its stride by the time of season 14, and I would have loved to have seen some of his ideas for season 15 come true. But anyway, so there's my take on what if Philip Hinchcliffe had stayed for season 15. But what did you think? Do you agree with my take on it or not? And would you have done anything differently? Please let me know in the comments section below. Anyway, so thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. Please don't forget to press that subscribe button below, as well as press the bell icon at the side of it, so that you'll stay notified of when all my new videos come out. This channel currently has 1,885 subscribers as of time of writing and recording this video, but if we can get to 2,500 by the end of this year, then I will do another Q&A where you can ask me whatever questions you want. Just keep them polite, please. Also, please rate and comment below your thoughts on all of this, and please feel free to donate to my Ko-fi page, link in the description, or send me a YouTube super thanks below if you want to, of course. And I shall see you all in another video. So until next time, bye bye.